us. How we doing this morning? Let's put our hands together and sing. Our God is with us, and we will not forget that you're fighting for us. Who can stop the work of your hands? Come on! And we've seen redemption at the heartbeat of our church. And we've seen addiction broken in hope of your love. Broken in hope of your love. Come on, sing this out. So we rejoice, for you have come, Emmanuel, Emmanuel, our King is come. Saw our story ending in the arms of your Son. So we're running to the arms of your Son. Hey, so we rejoice, for you have come. This morning, son, guys. You guys ready? I want you guys to sing this part out with me. We sing, we shout. Come on. We sing, we shout. 'Cause in our city you have moved. Our God, you came to us. Let's scream it out. Come on, we sing. We sing, we shout, 'cause in our city you have moved. Our God, you came to us. We sing, we shout, 'cause in our city you have moved. Our God, you came to us.
know you want me, how you love me, how you love me. Your kindness and mercy remind me how you love me, how you love me. As I am, oh Jesus, take me as I am. All my regrets and my failures, all of my wrongs have been left at the cross, and all that remains is the Father's love. Oh Lord, you take me as I am. Over and over you call me yours again. You see it all, so you want me, how you love me, how you love me. Your kindness and mercy remind me how you love me, how you love me. As I
It comes to haunt me. It tells me what I've done. It reminds me what's gone wrong. But when my sins are laid before me, my Lord, you take them on. Yes, my Lord, you take them on. So if I fall, and if I fall, I will trust your mercies greater than all others. And if I bend, and if I break, I trust that they hold me up greater than all my regrets. You're greater than all my regrets.
You call me out upon the waters, the great unknown, where feet may fail. And there I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep. My faith will stand, and I will call upon your name, and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. For I am yours, and you are Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hands will be my guide. Where feet may fail and fear surrounds me, you never fail, and you won't start now. So I will call upon your name, and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. And yours, you are mine. You are mine.
My heart a storm, clouds raging deep within. The Prince of Peace came bursting through the wind. The violent sky held its breath, and in your light I found rest. Tearing through the night, riding on the storm, staring down the fight. My eyes found yours, shining like the sun, striding through my fear. The Prince of Peace met me there, and heard my prayer. Let me hear you on this one. Hold like the sunlight piercing through the dark. The Prince of Peace came and broke into my heart. The violet cross, the empty grave, and in your light I found grace. Tearing through the night, riding on the storm, staring down the fire. My eyes found yours, shining like the sun, striding through my fear. The Prince of Peace met me there. And you're always there, and you hear my prayer. Song goes this morning, make this your prayer. Your love surrounds me. Come on, sing this out. Your love surrounds me in my heart. Surrounds me when my God soul will ever know that you are God. And you heard my prayer. Thank you all so much for singing with us this morning. You may be seated.
Y'all are so cute.
Good morning. Well, I'm Brett Watson. This is Susan Hickman. How come she got more than I did? Thank you. It's always great to be here with you guys. This is our family, right?
It's our family.
Yeah. So it's a pleasure to be up here. We're sharing with you today the fourth installment of this series that we're calling Practical Prescription. And this series is one where we're looking at these practical ideas, these practical concepts that help us to make it through life a little less chaotic, right? So let's just review real quick. The first week, we talked about this prescription. Stand up straight with your shoulders back and smile. And this is just about being intentional about living life with confidence, right? The second week was, I will tell myself I'm worth taking care of. You ever notice that if you're a dog lover, you'll never miss your dog's prescription? If the vet gives you medication for the dog, you'll never miss it. But that you might do that with yourself, right? This is a prescription that helps us to remember that we're worthwhile taking care of. Self-care is so important.
And then last week, Ricardo was up here with his good friend Josh, and they were talking about friendships and how those relationships can kind of frame your surroundings and your circumstances into a positive environment. And this week, we want to talk about you framing your own circumstances into a positive environment.
Yes, thank you. So this is the idea this week. Well, let me just read it to you. Oh, there it is. Comparing myself with others is like, no, that's later. Choosing to compare yourself with who you were, not with who others appear to be. So that's the idea today. All of us, let's be real with ourselves. All of us are hardwired to make comparisons with others. And this is simply due to our evolutionary development. It's how we develop meaning. We have to develop contrasts with things. We compare things with one another. So we do this with other people as well. But what we want to talk about is how to do that in the healthy way, to not do it in a toxic way.
And how do you know the difference?
That's a good question. Ultimately, you know the difference because of the fruit that's born out of the comparison, right? So what I mean by that is if the fruit of my comparing myself with someone else, let's say, is this negative self-speak, envy, jealousy, covetousness, well, it's toxic. If instead it comes out with, I see something that I could improve myself with, how can I use what I see in this person to lead to a better me? That's a healthy comparison. There's nothing wrong with that. So it just depends on the fruit.
Well, and I think too, it is the way it's framed. In my parenting class, I talk about naming your children's emotions to kind of decrease the intensity of them. And it works with us with envy. And I love the example your neighbor gets a new car, happens to be your dream car. And you're in your house and you're thinking, why? Why does he get that car? He's a slacker. He doesn't work near as hard as I do. And you just are festering this in yourself. But if you take that jealousy and you drag it out the front door into the yard and you yell across the way, Joe, dude, that car, you know that's my dream car? I am so jealous. Poof. It takes all the power out of that.
It really does. If you don't believe it, just try it once.
Try it.
It will. It just drags it out into the light. Pow. Yeah, so what do you think is the most, what's the best example in today's culture of toxic comparing?
Social media.
Social media, yes. So, you know, in our past, not too distant past, we lived in much smaller communities, didn't we? And in those smaller communities, everybody had a place to fit in. You know, for example, you only have in a small community room for like 1 or 2 auto mechanics, right? And that guy or that woman is considered the expert in that field. And that does something for them that's really valuable and something that we all need. We need to feel the good emotions that come from being recognized that way. So there's a right balance there that we require in order to be healthy emotionally, you know? So in this world, unfortunately, we're kind of plugged into with this pseudo access, this pseudo connection to billions of people in a global village. And I say it's a pseudo access because social media typically isn't reality. So the things, the people that we're looking at and we might be tempted to compare ourselves with isn't real. You said something about Andy Stanley.
Yeah, I love Andy Stanley's quote. It's that the reason so many of us struggle with insecurity is because we're comparing our behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel.
Yeah, and I liked, Ricardo read an article that he shared with us when we were looking over this stuff. Did you know that there are studios built to make it look like you're flying in a private jet? So that social media influencers, as they're called, can go in, do a photo shoot in this fake jet so that it looks like they're actually flying around the country in a private jet.
And even change clothes so it looks like they have several trips.
Yeah. I mean, this is where it's come to, you know, concerning this social media thing. If you're not on social media, this doesn't really apply to you. And good for you, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But many of us are. And so this is an environment that makes toxic comparisons really easy.
And a lot of people, they know it's not real. Like in your heart of hearts, you know it's not real, but your subconscious is saying, I wish I had that vacation. I wish my relationship with my significant other looked like that. Oh, I wish my kids had all that sports talent. You know, so that's kind of running through your head. And shameless plug, next week Larry and I are going to be talking about raising kids into adults that people like. So you want to make sure what you're modeling for your child is not the ping of social media reach.
Yes. Yeah, that's going to be good. So yeah, in our modern society today, we've kind of taken the comparison game to these absurd heights, you know? But the truth is that people have been playing the game from the beginning. There's a reason that you see right there in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not covet. There's a reason that the story of Cain and Abel is right up there at the front of the Bible. That's the story of the 2 brothers that bring sacrifices to God, and only one, Abel's sacrifice, is favored by God. So Cain lets this jealousy brew to the point that he ends up killing his brother. So it's something that we all deal with. It's something that we have been dealing with since the beginning of human history.
I think a really good tell is, are you celebrating others' wins? When you see somebody gets a new job, or you see that they're engaged, or are you going, oh, yay for you? Because when you celebrate others' big wins, that's a small win for you.
Yeah, well said. And that leads us to this first point that we want to make. So the truth is we're all running our own races. And we should recognize that. And comparing myself with others is usually unhelpful. It's like trying to use a spoon for a mirror. You might see something in that reflection that you need to fix, but you don't want to try to style your hair with it, right? So, Jordan Peterson put it this way. He said, be cautious when you're comparing yourself to others. You are a singular being. You have your own particular strengths, specific problems, financial, intimate, psychological, and otherwise. And those are embedded in a unique, broader context of your unique existence. In other words, comparing ourselves with others can never really be a completely reliable standard for the unique potential that you have, precisely because you are unique. There's only one of you in all of existence.
So you were saying something about sometimes when you can compare yourself with others, it leads to just comfortable limits.
Right. Yeah, it's either going to lead to comfortable limits, or it's going to lead to something like disappointment, or even scapegoating, which I'll explain later. But comfortable limits is simply this. Say I'm wrongly judging someone else's performance, and I'm really doing that to help myself feel better about my own mediocrity, or to excuse my own mediocrity. That's what I mean by comfortable limits. Setting the bar low.
But by the same token, if I'm comparing myself with someone else and I'm setting the bar uber high, then that's kind of setting me up for disappointment.
Yes, exactly.
So explain the concept of scapegoating.
Well, scapegoating it's a term that corresponds with a ritual that the Jewish people practiced in biblical times, or part of a ritual. And this was always done one time a year during the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And so at this part of the ritual, the high priest would lay his hands on a live goat, and he would then recall all the sins of the nation and symbolically transfer the guilt of those sins onto that living goat. And then somebody would be assigned to take that living goat out into the wilderness and then abandon it there to fend for itself and, of course, die. So that's where the term scapegoating comes from.
So that's just kind of like blame, or blaming others for our shortcomings, kind of?
In part, yeah, it is. But it can be just as subtle as looking at someone else's shortcomings to feel better about my own.
So what do we do to avoid the toxic comparisons and start comparing ourselves to who we were instead of who others are?
Great question. So what do we do to avoid these things? Well, it begins with knowing yourself. Socrates, I think, said, knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom. But I think the Bible really adds something to that. It says the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. In other words, knowing God and having that standard set before you. They both apply here, but how do we get to know ourselves? That's an important question to ask. All of us should be asking ourselves regularly, how well do I know myself? How well am I performing this self-analysis? How regularly am I doing this self-analysis? So last week, this is a really hard process. It is. Let's just be honest about that. And last week we talked about, as you pointed out earlier, that by surrounding ourselves with positive people, we create a safe environment for ourselves in our outer world, right? Well, we do the same thing with ourselves when we establish a safe space inside. This is really important.
Well, like you said, self-analysis is hard. So what can we do to make it a little easier?
Well, to establish that safe place, one of the things that we can do is to remind ourselves of what God thinks of us. You know, this is what Jesus did, right? This was his reason for coming. He wanted to get rid of that concept of God that has him as this angry deity that has to be appeased by blood, and to replace that with this concept of a loving father who runs to you, who accepts you with love and unconditionality. And when we do that, we establish a safe place on the inside to take risks with life, to strive for potential without worrying about how we might trip or fall along the way, and without having to compare ourselves with others, because we're okay with ourselves.
We're loved.
We're loved.
So that is kind of framing it for yourself. But what are some practical stuff? You know me. I got to go with the practical here.
And that's good. That's why you're up here.
Give me some feet. Tell me how to really go about the self-analysis.
Bring it out of the nebulous.
Yes.
Okay. So what are some things you can do practically? Well, we talk about meditation and prayer. Really important tool. In fact, I think it was Richard Foster said that to pray is to change. So when we quiet our minds and we focus on God, we focus on our relationship with God, on ourselves in self-analysis, we get to know ourselves better. So that's one way. You also added journaling. It's really helpful for you, and it should be, because when we write, it forces us to think differently. So that's a really great recommendation. If you need to, you can go to a professional for counseling to help you to unpack who you are, to really get to know who you are. Some need to do that, and professionals are trained to help you with that process. And then you have adversity. What I mean by that in this context is choosing to do the hard things that you don't like to do. Being intentional about that. I'm going to take some time today, 5-10 minutes, to get quiet and really think about what's going on in my life and what is there that are my strengths, what is there that are my weaknesses, and where to go from there. If you don't, by the way, adversity is going to come. And it will uncover who you really are, but it's a lot easier if you're intentional about stepping into some of that yourself wisely, right?
Right.
So this is difficult stuff, to be sure, but it's definitely worth it. And it's difficult because we're dealing with what Pastor Larry called it this many weeks ago, the internal critic. It's what Carl Jung referred to as the shadow. It's what the Bible refers to sometimes as the flesh or sinful nature. It's that part of ourselves that we don't like to look at and we don't like others looking at. And so it kind of stays in the shadows. And for that reason, it's hiding out in the unconscious. But Jung warned us of something. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call it fate. So this is a good thing to avoid, and it leads to our next point. Don't ignore the internal critic. Integrate it. So what is that?
It's that wee small voice, that internal dialogue that we set up for ourselves. It may be saying, I can't, I'm not worthy, I'm not enough. And we need to make sure that that internal dialogue is nice.
Yes.
Make it kind.
Yeah.
Make your internal dialogue nice to you.
And the truth is, most of us avoid this, but the other truth to this is that the internal critic is something that we all have to deal with. And it can either be a tyrant or it can be a companion on the journey, a helpful companion on the journey, depending on how we deal with it. And that's what Jung means by bringing it into consciousness, right? So this can be helpful. It's part of you that you can influence, in other words. You can influence it and you can benefit from it if you bring it into conscious dialogue, remembering that safe place that we talked about that God has you in, where you are accepted, you're loved, you're free. You can handle this. So you can teach the internal critic, and this is important, you can teach it to acknowledge that status as God's kid, and then also teach it to be kind in its critique of self. Now, what you've done is you and God have turned the potentially tyrant, which is what it is for most of us, right? You've turned it into this kind of honest friend that genuinely wants what's best for you. And this is part of what Jesus means. Jesus is brilliant. This is what he means in John 3 when he says, Everyone who does evil hates the light and avoids it, so that his actions won't be exposed. But everyone who lives in the truth comes into the light, so that all may see that his actions are accomplished with God. It's beautiful, isn't it? So drag it into light. Make it go poof. So you were talking about that negative internal dialogue and how we shouldn't let it spill over, and that you need to model that positive self-speak for your kids.
Especially for your kids, yeah. If you're letting that spill over, does this dress make me look heavy or whatever? Your daughter's seeing that, you know? Mm-hmm. How about, oh, it brings out my eyes.
Yes.
There you go.
Really need to be careful. More on that next week, like you said.
Right.
You also said something earlier that leads to this third point, and that is celebrate small victories. And you said that when we do that, we have our own win.
You find when you feel better about yourself that it's okay that that person got that new job. It's great for them.
Yes. But we also say, keep one eye fixed on Jesus, right? Yeah. So we start by changing or challenging ourselves with small things, attainable goals. We celebrate those small victories. This is important. Why? Because it keeps our heads up, our shoulders back, right? It's part of that first week, living confidently. And it also helps us to go on to bigger and bigger accomplishments that we want for our lives. It also, and this is what's so important about keeping the one eye fixed on Jesus, is it sets out a standard for the me that Jesus would be if he were me. You follow? The me that Jesus would be if he were me. So you're an individual. You have unique strengths and unique problems and so on. So it's not being Jesus, it's being the you Jesus would be if he were you. This is so important because the truth is, for human beings, the real joy is not found in reaching the peak, reaching the summit. The real joy is found in the journey there. Isn't that true?
It's so true.
So we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus because he provides the joy of our potential. Not something to shame ourselves with,
right?
But to look and say, I could be like that. I could be a version of me like him, right? So the me that Jesus would be if he were me.
Which leads us to our little practical prescription. So you have work to do this week. First of all, this week, I will not compare myself to others. Easier said than done, right? So there's a few steps you can do to do this. Take a social media vacation. Everybody's like, but that's how I keep in touch with people. You know what? You could call them. You could go to coffee with them. So you could write them a note. So go old school this week with keeping in touch with friends. Take some time for self-reflection, like Brett was saying, maybe some meditation or journaling. That's very helpful to kind of figure out who you are. But lastly, remind yourself that you are loved, accepted, and free. This is so important, and this is framing that positive environment for you. It's the nature of God's perfect love for you. And that's a really good environment. That's a very positive environment, and it provides for your growth. So that's your practical prescription for this week.
Yeah. So let me pray for you, and then I'll close with a short story. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the truth that we are your kids. We are accepted. We are loved without condition. And that we have that launch pad to serve for us as the place where we launch into better and better versions of ourselves as we strive for our potential. Help us, if we're going to make comparisons, to make them in healthy ways, but to really stop comparing so much with others and acknowledging the unique and beautiful treasure that each of us is, and just striving to be the best version of ourselves. We thank you for the courage that you give us and that safe place that you give us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So I found a cute story about the great concert pianist Paderewski. And the story goes like this. A mother had her son in piano lessons, and he was kind of begrudgingly. He didn't want to be there so much. So she thought when Paderewski was coming to town, she would take him to see this great pianist, and he would be inspired to continue with his lessons, right? So she got him tickets right down by the front row, and as they were waiting for the show to begin and the lights were dim, she starts a conversation with the people next to her. Then 8 o'clock rolls around, the lights go up, and everybody's attention goes to the stage, right? But what they find there is this grand piano with a little boy sitting at it, banging out Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with one finger. The mother's horrified, of course. She said, oh, how am I going to get him down from there? So she starts to make her way to the platform, but then Paderewski himself comes out onto the platform, and he signals to her, it's okay. And he walks up behind the little boy playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and he whispers in his ear, don't stop. Keep playing. And he reaches around with his left arm, and he starts to fill in the bass part. And then he reaches around the little boy, placing his arm around him, and then he starts the obligato. And between the two of them, the master and the novice create a symphony that mesmerizes the entire crowd. And as God's kids, we often think of our lives as simply pecking out simple tunes that don't really possess a whole lot of meaning. What we need to do is to hear the still small voice of our Father saying the same thing to us. Don't stop. Keep playing. And if we do that, we'll find that we too are composing a symphony that beautifully shows this relationship that I have with God, and reaching further and further into my own potential. Remember, you are a work in progress, and the end product is a masterpiece built by you and by God. He loves you today. So do we. Thanks for coming.
Love y'all.
It tells me what I've done.